The all-new Inside Sources. Your inside access to the people and policies shaping Utah's future. Here are Greg Skordas and Holly Richardson on KSL NewsRadio.
It's like turning around the Titanic. That's how one Utah lawmaker is explaining President Trump's latest executive order that will impact homeless policy in the United States.
That lawmaker is Representative Tyler Clancy, and he's worked on this issue from multiple angles. We'll talk to him in just a second about why he says this is a sea change in policy and why it's like turning the Titanic, but we wanted to just briefly set up what this executive order from President Trump does.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but it tends to shift the sort of the recognition and the emphasis on homelessness, and recognize that people who a lot of our homeless population have drug addiction or serious mental illness, and maybe we should treat this as a public safety issue as much as a housing issue, and that it tends to open up. And I'm trying to wrap my head around it a little bit. I'm glad we have Tyler here. The prospect of civil commitment, which we haven't historically thought of as a remedy to the homeless situation. But I will recognize, I just from my own experience dealing with a lot of that population, that there are mental health and other issues involved that aren't addressed through some of the things we're doing already.
Right, and the executive order also wants cities and states to really start to do away with what they're calling camping, to do away with this maybe more permissive attitude towards drug use. They're not in Utah, but in some places there are exchange programs, those types of things, right? There's a conversation between, do we make it easier? Is that enabling? Do we keep it safe? But one of the people who has really been involved with addressing people experiencing homelessness and what that means in the state is Representative Clancy, and he has seen it from multiple angles, and I'm so glad he can join us. Thanks, Representative Clancy, for being on the line with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, and it's an important topic.
I'm wondering if you can start off by telling us, first of all, your initial reaction to this executive order, and then we can talk about some of the details in it.
Absolutely. I was really happy when I saw President Trump do this executive order. And what I saw in the executive order is that this is now the federal government recognizing this as a humanitarian issue, not just a housing issue or a public safety issue. And I think that tracks, right? When you go around and you talk to people who either have that lived experience or you talk to people who have, serve that population, much like you do, Greg, in many ways, they say, is it a housing issue? Yes. Is it a public safety issue? Yes. Is it a drugs issue? Yes. Is it a mental health issue? Yes. And so it's not one or the other. And that's where I think our federal government has been gridlocked. To me, this seems as an all-the-above approach while still recognizing the importance of public safety.
Tyler, I think you nailed it, and I appreciate what you just said. Tell our listeners what the state of Utah has done already and why this latest executive order sort of dovetails with what Utah is doing, or at least what Utah is planning to do.
Well, I'll start by just sharing that I think a lot of people don't understand what the federal government's role was in doing and solving homelessness. It was a part of this philosophy called housing first. And the idea, I think a lot of people agree with, which is someone's not going to get stable until they have a roof over their head. And I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But in practice, what that created was a set of rules and regulations that prohibited funding for any organization that tried to do anything beyond just here's a key to your new apartment. And so if you had programs that had more of an intensive therapeutic element to help people get off drugs or get into significant mental health treatment, those you were disqualified from federal funding. So in Utah, we actually started to shift even before the federal funds moved. So we started programs that looked at this from a human first perspective, not just a housing first. And so recognizing that each individual has a unique story, they have unique challenges and opportunities, and our policies need to reflect that.
So you called this a sea change. You also said it was like turning around the Titanic. And can you explain to our listeners why it's such a change? I mean, you talked about housing first, but what is it about this that makes you feel like, A, it's turning the Titanic, but B, it's such a huge change?
I think a lot of people hesitate to recognize, to say to kind of have the courage to say, you know what, these unsanctioned camping and these open-air drug markets, it is driven by methamphetamine. It is driven by the fentanyl crisis. And I think they fear that because they think people will start to blame people who are homeless. This is your decision. This is your choice. But I don't think it has to be that way, right? I think we can still acknowledge the unique realities of drug addiction without shaming people or without making them feel like they're not worth our time and our effort and our resources. I think it's actually the opposite. Until we have an honest conversation about what these challenges are, we're never going to help people heal. And so what I saw with this executive order, and the reason I said this is really a sea change, is not only did it acknowledge the complexity of this issue, but now it's directing those federal agencies that for years, for over a decade, have prohibited funds to go to these more unique or innovative programs. It opens the door. And so I kind of expected more of a gradual change. And it seems like the Trump administration is saying, nope, we're going to allow a broad set of tools for a very diverse population.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned funding, Representative Clancy, because it doesn't seem, as I'm understanding it, that this is going to be an increase in cost, but maybe a shift in cost, a shift in where we're putting our resources. Is that your understanding as well?
Certainly. I think from the executive order standpoint, that's where it's allowing the funds to be used in different ways. So we have programs in Utah that, for example, if you go to this specific shelter, they'll tell you, hey, listen, you can come here. We're going to serve you. We're going to give you food, but you've got to come to the 12-step program and you've got to make your bed in the morning. You would be disqualified from federal funds before this executive order. Those are the kinds of things that those types of programs are going to see the ability to have federal funds that weren't there before. So in some ways, yes. I think on the back end, you nailed it, Greg. We've got to be now we're getting that accountability piece. We're getting the programming piece right. And now I think that actually unlocks funding. I think what frustrates people, either policymakers and constituents, is when I take groups around or we walk around, areas that are impacted by these issues, a lot of people say, aren't we spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this issue, but it's not getting better? To me, this opens the door for that trust to be built back, which eventually I think will lead to increased funding.
Can you talk to us really briefly about the civic commitment component? I know there are people who are quite concerned about that.
Definitely. So the civil commitment component, and I think it's broad, but I think the fundamental issue of it is recognizing that there's actually a condition that a lot of people are experiencing on the street. It's called agnosia. And this is a condition in which someone's experiencing a severe and persistent mental illness, but they don't recognize it, right? So if you or I we're in a dark place and we needed to seek help, we would have the knowledge to say, this isn't me. These aren't the thoughts I normally have. I need to go get help. With agnosia, and that's what a lot of individuals on our street and unsheltered homelessness are experiencing, they can't recognize that. And so that's where you're seeing people continue to deteriorate and not getting the health care that they need. And so this is really, being precise about, these are people who you or I, none of us on this call, we're not mental health experts, but yet we could go into an encampment and see someone with a staph infection the size of a baseball on their shoulder or a gaping wound on their neck. We all know that person needs help right now. But the way that our current laws have been, and also to some extent our capacity constraints, is we've actually been prohibited from helping those individuals until they've already hurt someone or they've already hurt themselves, or they've proverbially, at that edge. And so this is going to open the door to shift more resources to make sure people can get the help they need, get the health care that they need to heal and eventually move on with their life. And it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
That was Representative Tyler Clancy, who explained something, Holly, that I've been reading this morning and didn't understand, but how educational to have him with us this morning. When we come back after the break, I want to continue this conversation and the shift in policy to those that are experiencing homelessness, and including some things you just mentioned, Holly, which was expanding civil commitments.
Inside Sources.
Let's continue our conversation about homelessness and the executive order that was issued this recently by President Trump that really I think you can't understate how it's a shift in the way that we're approaching homelessness. We've used words like turning around the Titanic
Right.
and the sea. But I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it, but the executive order, it seems to be that it will allow agencies a more direct approach to what we've called civil commitments. And instead of just putting money into, and I think Trump said something like just building housing and then
Right.
and without any restrictions or any covenants that really make sense, let's deal with the mental health and the drug addiction part of it. He's calling it a criminal justice referendum almost. He had a name for it, Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets,
Right.
which is a good name if you want money. But it's also, I do agree that we haven't, and I think a lot of people would agree that we haven't dealt with the homeless situation as well as we could have by simply building new housing.
You know, and Representative Clancy joined us, but we talked a little bit about housing first policy. And I remember when the Utah legislature started steering their efforts towards this housing first policy, right? The idea is if you have a roof over your head, you can become more stable. But this issue, it's not a simple issue, right? It's very complex. And we know that a lot of the people who are experiencing homelessness have mental illness. We know a lot of them also have drug addiction issues. A lot of them, of course, will have both at the same time. We know that veterans as a group specifically experience higher rates of homelessness than other populations. And so they have complex issues that need to be dealt with as well. And one of the things that Representative Clancy explained to us really is that this is an approach that in some ways frees up federal funding, but it also gives, again, states and municipalities more flexibility in the way they want to address this issue.
You know, I think a lot of people hesitate to recognize, to kind of have the courage to say, you know what, these unsanctioned camping and these open-air drug markets, it is driven by methamphetamine. It is driven by the fentanyl crisis. And I think they fear that because they think people will start to blame people who are homeless. This is your decision. This is your choice. But I don't think it has to be that way, right? I think we can still acknowledge the unique realities of drug addiction without shaming people or without making them feel like they're not worth our time and our effort and our resources. I think it's actually the opposite. Until we have an honest conversation about what these challenges are, we're never going to help people heal. And so what I saw with this executive order, and the reason I said this is really a sea change, is not only did it acknowledge the complexity of this issue, but now it's directing those federal agencies that for years, for over a decade, have prohibited funds to go to these more unique or innovative programs. It opens the door. And so I kind of expected more of a gradual change. And it seems like the Trump administration is saying, nope, we're going to allow a broad set of tools for a very diverse population.
Trump's not necessarily known for his gradual changes. I mean, when he makes a shift and makes a change in policy, it's pretty significant. You know, we have forever, at least in my experience, dealt with the homeless situation as they call it a housing only or housing issue. This shifts the focus a little bit, maybe a lot, into, like you said a minute ago, Holly, mental health and substance abuse issues, and dealing, let's face it, dealing with certain populations such as our veterans, and trying to figure out, rather than just building more low-income housing, dealing with the underlying problem of homelessness.
Right. There really are just so many moving parts to this issue. And Utah, of course, is not the only state dealing with this. And Utah, in some ways, is a lot better situated, especially to take advantage of the changes with this new executive order. But, you know, if you go up to, say, Washington and Oregon has had for a long time a policy of saying we're going to have, you know, safe needle exchange zones, and we're going to, you know, have all these other things to make it safe for people we know they're going to use anyway, so we're going to make it safe. They are starting to back away from some of that because it just hasn't worked, right? It just hasn't worked out well. And it's one of the issues, again, where you look at this issue and you say, well, I can fix this one thing. No, you have to fix a lot of things kind of at the same time. And one of the things that Utah has been doing, and I've seen this in several locations actually around the state, they're trying to have, I want to say like a one size. It's not a one size fits all. It's a one-stop shop. That's what I'm looking for, where you can go and people who are experiencing homelessness can get mental health counseling. They can get addiction counseling or help and support. They can work on, getting into a place where they can live. And we have to remember too that people experiencing homelessness fall usually into two camps. One, chronically homeless, and the other one is acutely homeless, or it's short-term. Maybe they had, a really unexpected medical expense, or they just they got booted out of the apartment where they were renting and they're in between jobs, but this is not going to last, versus the chronically homeless population.
Yeah, and I think it would have been helpful, and maybe tomorrow we can get someone from the homeless community, a homeless advocate, to talk to us about their feelings about this. Because when I think of civil commitments,
right,
I think of something much more egregious than what we're dealing with here, which is, and maybe not, maybe I'm overthinking it, but we typically think of a person being civilly committed as being, well, the law requires actually that they're a danger to themselves or others.
Right.
So opening up that avenue to the homeless population, who don't on their face seem to be people who are a danger to themselves or others. I mean,
I think you can argue that they are, though.
But they absolutely are,
right,
by virtue of the fact that they're homeless, and a lot of them are being abused. Let's face it,
right,
a lot of them are victims,
right,
all the time of what they're dealing with. So, but we also have talked, what was it, a week or so ago, Holly, with the people at the state hospital or representative about,
yeah, right,
they're 140 years old, but their bed population, their bed space has actually decreased over time. I don't know how we're going to.
Well, Governor Cox, when he celebrated that 140-year anniversary, he actually said we need more beds. Look, that's one of the concerns, and I am seeing this in news stories across the nation and from different organizations, and they're saying this is cruel and unusual punishment, right? You're talking about rounding up people with mental illness and shoving them in state mental institutions or even jail. And Representative Clancy, I mean, he, to his credit, he said, look, that's not the goal. The goal is to help these people get over their addictions, learn how to function in society.
Yeah, and he talked about, when we interviewed him earlier, about how he feels the executive order opens the door for a change.
I think from the executive order standpoint, that's where it's allowing the funds to be used in different ways. So we have programs in Utah that, for example, if you go to this specific shelter, they'll tell you, hey, listen, you can come here, we're going to serve you, we're going to give you food, but you've got to come to the 12-step program, and you've got to make your bed in the morning. You would be disqualified from federal funds before this executive order. Those are the kinds of things that those types of programs are going to see the ability to have federal funds that weren't there before. So in some ways, yes. I think on the back end, you nailed it, Greg. We've got to be now we're getting that accountability piece, we're getting the programming piece right, and now I think that actually unlocks funding. I think what frustrates people, either policymakers and constituents, is when I take groups around or we walk around, areas that are impacted by these issues. A lot of people say, aren't we spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this issue, but it's not getting better? To me, this opens the door for that trust to be built back, which eventually I think will lead to increased funding.
Yeah, I'm looking at this article by Brigham Tomko in the Deseret News, who also interviewed Grant Miller, who I know is a public defender. He's a fairly new legislator, who talked about where we're going financially. And he's of course, has proposed not a victim's Bill of Rights. I worked on that one, the homeless Bill of Rights. But he said that at a time when we're cutting back on Medicaid, and the One Big Beautiful Bill did that in large part, that's where a lot of the funding for this community comes from in the first place. So on the one hand, we're saying, hey, we need to focus more resources and money, let's face it, to the homeless community. On the other hand, we're saying, well, let's cut back Medicaid, one of their biggest sources of income.
KSL News Radio.
As we talked about earlier in the show, President Trump issued an executive order which aims to move those experiencing homelessness into treatment facilities.
So the move, and we talked about this, like you mentioned, it really is saying, can we make it easier for civil commitment? Can we get people into either hospitals or maybe even jails, right, where they can get some additional treatment? But some people are saying this is a sea change in the right direction. Some people are saying this is an unfunded mandate and it's callous and it's uncaring. But again, in Utah, we have already kind of been moving that direction.
Right, and we spoke with Representative Tyler Clancy about just that.
This is really, being precise about, these are people who, you or I, none of us on this call, we're not mental health experts, but yet we could go into an encampment and see someone with a staph infection the size of a baseball on their shoulder or a gaping wound on their neck. We all know that that person needs help right now. But the way that our current laws have been, and also to some extent our capacity constraints, is we've actually been prohibited from helping those individuals until they've already hurt someone or they've already hurt themselves, or they've proverbially, at that edge. And so this is going to open the door to shift more resources to make sure people can get the help they need, get the health care that they need to heal and eventually move on with their life. And it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
So we're actually going to be talking with Bill Tibbitts. He's the Deputy Executive Director of the Crossroads Urban Center, which is a Salt Lake City-based nonprofit that offers services to low-income people. And we wanted to get your reaction to this executive order, Bill. I wonder if you could share that with us.
Well, I think that it's important to realize that this executive order doesn't just impact the people we see on the street, but it also could potentially impact the hundreds, thousands of people that we have moved off the streets into permanent supportive housing, because it says that states should move away, that we should move away from permanent supportive housing toward involuntary commitment. And I think, unfortunately, what people don't understand is that when people have mental health conditions that lead to them being homeless for a year and more, they're going to need ongoing help beyond the crisis care that is usually prevented in a mental health institution. And so I think it is. I mean, I think the problem with every approach that our country has ever used to addressing homelessness is we've always wanted to accomplish more than we're willing to pay for. We've underfunded healthcare programs. We've underfunded affordable housing programs. We've underfunded particularly mental health care systems. And so I think the idea that we can go back to just that somehow going back to like involuntarily committing people indefinitely, that's actually an even more expensive way of addressing homelessness than what we're doing now. And I think what that means is that potentially we will have more people homeless because we will not, if we don't increase funding, if we're going to go with a more expensive approach to dealing with homelessness, then we're going to have to spend more money. And the state mental hospital is the most expensive place to keep someone. It's more, the second most expensive is a jail. And that's why supportive housing for people who have ongoing mental health needs is so important.
So, Bill, can you tell us what you think was behind this? I mean, why now and why this? And, of course, we did speak with our own representative who said this is sort of in line with what the Utah delegation, the Utah representatives locally have been trying to do. But why do you think this came from the executive?
I think that there's a sort of a pendulum on homeless services where there periodically there's this idea that if we do more to incarcerate people, to lock people up, that will solve homelessness. But we to do and so I think it's another attempt to try that approach. I think that sort of that is the knee-jerk reaction that people come up with when they think, well, how can we deal with this? But unfortunately, incarcerating someone for 2 weeks for camping is not necessarily going to make any difference if they're released to the streets.
So Bill, I'm sorry. When we were talking when we were talking with Representative Clancy, one of the things that Greg actually mentioned was it's a housing issue, it's a mental health issue, it's an addiction issue, right? It's potentially an employment issue. We know that it's complex. We know that the problems are complex, and we know that people who are experiencing homelessness are much more likely than the population at large to be experiencing both mental illness issues and addiction issues. What do you see as I think what we're seeing is that people are saying, well, this is a compassionate approach because it provides accountability, but it also provides services if they are civilly committed. But what are you seeing as a solution to this really complex problem? What would you like to see more of?
Well, first off, I think that there are people who are homeless who need a lot less intervention than all of this. And it's always important to remember that when we talk about people with serious mental illness and addiction issues, that those are the most visible homeless people, but they're a very small percentage of the people who actually show up in shelters. And so, but for those people who are in that chronically homeless category, there are programs that work. First Step House has some amazing programs where they take people who have been abusing substances on the streets for years and help them to get clean, but then they have supportive housing that helps them to stay on their meds, because with people who have those co-occurring conditions where they have mental health issues that make them more susceptible to using drugs is self-treatment, but also just they have lower impulse control. Somebody offers them something, they're more likely to say yes without thinking about it. You can get somebody clean from drugs, but that won't make their schizophrenia go away. There are medications that mitigate schizophrenia, but they don't work as well for some people as they do for others. And so I think, you have to, if you're going, there's no short-term solution for people like that. You have to say, if you're going to help that person stay out of homelessness, and you've got to commit to it for the long term, just like you would for somebody who has a physical disability or, somebody with a clear cognitive limitations. We don't give people short-term treatment for Down syndrome and then release them to the streets, right? There are people who need long-term help, and we have programs for doing that. And I think homelessness, if there are populations that disproportionately become homeless, and if we make plans for helping those specific subpopulations avoid homelessness or avoid returning to homelessness, that we can succeed. And I think that there are things Utah is doing that are moving in that direction. I think involuntary commitment is always a short-term thing. People are committed for a week or two. If you don't have a plan for after those 2 weeks, you're not really doing anything.
Well said.
You're just spending more money.
That's Bill Tibbitts, Deputy Executive Director of the Crossroads Urban Center.